Hello, I'm Shane in Sweden, and this is the third part on our series of videos on building a security tool that allows us to check HTTP response headers. In the first video, we went over the background to HTTP response headers and why we need to think about them from a security point of view and illustrate the need for a security tool for our software development lifecycle. And the last part, we tested a module that took as an input a list of key value pairs of headers and their values and created some sort of scoring on how good or bad the headers were from a security point of view. In this video, we're going to move further and actually build a specialized type of browser, web browser, that we can use to fetch the headers from a specified URL. And with those headers, we can then use them as an input for our scoring module. So we can connect everything together to create a command line utility that can score headers from a web page. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to create a new unit test as usual. That's where we start. And this will be for our web utilities class, which doesn't actually exist yet. So let's create a new unit test. And we're going to rename that immediately. Call that web utils tests. And we'll rename it in the class as well. Okay. So we have our new test class for this web utility we're going to build. So let's add that web utility. And this will be the class that will actually go out to the internet, fetch a web page, and then use the scoring utility, the scoring module we built in the last project. Now again, normally this class would be probably a public utility, so that it'd be available from another module because it would normally be a library class. But as we said here, we're doing everything in the same small utility, the same small executable, but we need to be able to test this still. So we're going to create this as an internal class, and we're going to add the same assembly tag as we had before, the internal is visible, the friends tag, so that this internal class will be accessible from our test unit tests. And we need to add the using to compiler services so that we're able to compile that. So we have our web utils, and we can start with our test. So as before, we're going to use the same pattern, the assert, arrange, act, assert pattern. So if we just copy that template and paste it in, so we can use it here. And our first method, what we're going to test is fetching a web page and looking at the contents there. I guess we can start off with fetching a web page. So if we design a method where we're getting a web page, and we're going to fetch the content, and we want, I don't know, perhaps we'll check that the content isn't empty. So we have our name, and we can start with the arrangement. Now we want to build some sort of specialized object, I guess a specialized browser that will fetch headers or web content for us. We're not really sure what that is just yet. So we can start off with an interface, which we can call perhaps iBrowser. And this will be an encapsulation of the methods that we need, even though we haven't actually defined any classes yet. So we'll call our instance an iBrowser browser, and we'll have to create some sort of test browser so we can check our method and create an instance of that for this test. Okay, so we generate the interface class, which is currently, of course, in the wrong project. So we move that up to our executable, and let's remove that from the test project. Let's just fix the namespace on it. Okay, so we have our iBrowser interface. The question is, what do we want in it? Ultimately, I guess we want headers. So if we can go back to how our headers look like. In our tests, we were using a key value pair, a list of them. So I guess in our iBrowser, ultimately we're going to look for some method that returns from a web page a key value pair, a list of it, which contains the headers. So we can create a method which called here get HTTP headers, which will return our headers list, and it will take as an input perhaps, I don't know, a system URI. So let's add the system using. Okay, so we have our first interface method, and we'll need to test that this works. Oh, we're getting Right, we need to add the generic collections as well because we've got a list. So if we test this now, we can, oh wait, we're not recognizing the iBrowser. We need to add a using for the, or a reference to the secure header score. So let's put that in. So that it recognizes the iBrowser interface. And now we can generate a test browser class, I guess. So let's add a new class called test browser. And I guess this can be a public class for the moment. And of course, it needs to implement our iBrowser interface. Okay, so we have our test class, which returns our key value pair, even though the method is not actually implemented. So let's copy our return type here, which is our list of headers. And in the act, we will fetch a list of headers. Using our test browser. And the test browser takes some sort of URI. So let's create a new URI based on some fake URL. It's not really important right now. And we need to add system generic collections, yes, so we can compile. So now we've got a test which we compile, and we just need to add our assert, what we're going to be testing for here. So initially we can just test, see that we get some headers back from our browser using our fetch headers method. Almost every web page has some headers, so we would expect that the headers we return would never be equal to 0. So we can test for that as our initial test case. So we can run our test, we can run all our tests actually, and we should get a failure here because we haven't actually implemented anything. We should get a not implemented method exception. And yes, we've got an error, and if we look at what the error is, it's not actually the error expected. Here we're getting an error on an invalid URI, and that's probably because, well, our URL here does not include the protocol, so we should actually have a HTTP or HTTPS or mail to or FTP or one of the protocols. So if we run our tests again, and this is why these sort of simple tests are useful for it, because they help identify potential problems which may turn up later on, problems which can be very simply fixed right now. And now if we look at the error again, having run the test, now we're getting the method or operation is not implemented where our expected error. So we can go to our method now and do something about the implementation. Now this is a simple test class, so we can actually, initially here, we can just return a fixed set of headers, or since we're trying to simulate a web page which has no headers, perhaps an empty list. So if we just copy some text here, here we have a list of headers. And if we paste that in, we just want to return this list. Wait, we just take away that. And let's return our headers. Okay, so we have a very simple test browser which returns a fixed set of 2 headers. And our test is expecting non-zero headers, so we should get a green result on this. And indeed, it's passed. The number of headers was not equal to 0. I assume it was equal to 2. So now we can go further by creating a new test, which will test our browser's ability to fetch some headers, and in combination perhaps with our scoring utility, which allowed us to give the evaluation of these headers as good or bad. So we can fetch some more web content, but this time we're going to get a score, and those headers we had should give us, we had one good header and one bad header, so we should have a +1 and a -1. So now we need to add a call to our scoring utility. So let's add that in. This using the score utils. We're going to score some headers. And of course, we send in the headers we've received from our test browser, our fixed set of headers. And that should return for us score. which is a tuple containing the two integers containing the positive score and the negative score, as we saw in the previous project. So we have our result, and then we just need to change our assert statement. The minus scores should be -1 and the positive score should be +1. So the positive score goes into item 1 and the negative score goes into item 2. So that should be -1 there. Okay, so we run our test again and we're getting an error. Okay, we've got the wrong assert here. It shouldn't be R not equal, it should be R equal. Let's change that and run our test again. And that's green. Great. So now we would like to implement a real browser that actually fetches real headers for us. So let's create a test for that. And first of all, we need to know what sort of test result we would like to see. Now, if we go and look at google.com under our F12 developer window and look at the headers that they provide, we can see they actually have a header which is considered to be somewhat negative. It reveals too much information, called the server. And it's one of the headers that we actually check for already, so we can use this website as a good example, as a good test for our new browser. Okay, so if we create a new test, and we're going to fetch some Google web content. And we know that of the headers that we check for here at the moment, none of them will be positive and one of them will be negative, the server. So we should end up with the result -1. Now we're actually going to test an actual instance of our real header browser, our specialized browser, which of course doesn't exist. So let's just generate that in a new file. And of course, this will unfortunately generate it in our test assembly. So we just move that to our main assembly, our executable assembly, and remove it from the test assembly. And as before, we just need to check that it'll end up with the right namespace, secure header score. It looks okay. So let's go back to our test class then for web utils. Now we can create our new header browser. This time we're going to send in the URL to Google's website. And as a result, we should expect no positive headers because there are positive headers, but none that we test for at the moment, and one negative header, server. So we can see that we can't compile because our header browser does not implement the methods in our iBrowser interface. So let's go back and implement that interface. And at the moment it throws a not implemented exception, so let's run our test. We should get a method not implemented exception. And there we go, method not implemented. Now we need to implement some sort of browser here, and we can of course roll our own with the .NET classes, but in this case I think we're going to go with something much easier. We'll just take a ready provided solution. It's a NuGet package, and we're going to use Scrapey Sharp, which is a handy NuGet package which is built-in functionality. Whoops, sorry, my Swedish showing there. Built-in functionality for scraping websites. So we're just going to install that. Now there are a number of different packages here. I think we could do the same thing with HTML Agility, which actually Scrapey Sharp uses. And there are other packages we can, of course, use as well. .NET Spider. This is the one we're going to test. And you can see that the NuGet package installs a number of references for us. And we'll be able to use the Scrapey browser, I think, to fetch our content. So if we go to our browser class, so the method here is going to return our list of headers. So let's create a new list. I'm going to set that initially to null, and then we'll return that list. Hopefully it won't be null when we return it. Now we're going to create a new Scrapey Sharp web browser, which is under network. There we go, scraping browser. But actually, all the methods that in the header browser are probably going to use the actual scraping browser, so we should move that to a private property, which is initialized when we instantiate the class. So let's add a constructor. Hit the tab key to generate the constructor method, and we will initialize our scraping browser. And often when you're using a scraping browser, there's various parameters on it you have to set, so it's good to have construction of a new browser in the same place, so you can set different properties, but we're not going to do that here. So we've got our browser, and we're going to navigate to a page, which is our URI. And we can fetch our web content using the get method, the get verb. Okay, so we have our fetch. We just need to return our result, which in this case would be, in the Scrapey browser's case, it's a web page, which is a Scrapey Sharp class. And we just need to add a using, so it recognizes that it's Scrapey Sharp class. Okay, so we have our method. It returns a web page. But what we really want from that web page is the headers, the HTTP headers, which we can find under the raw, not content, it should be raw response. There, we can see raw response. Raw response contains the headers. And let's just see what type that is. And actually, it's a key value pair list. I guess I probably knew that some way in the back of my mind when I was building our test classes. So, which is quite handy for us. It returns our headers. So we can go back to our test now. Now we have our class, which returns our content headers. We can, in fact, just go through our test and see if it runs now that we're using a real browser. But actually, I've made a mistake here, really. Why are we testing fetching content and then passing it out to another unit, which then scores the headers? Really, we want to encapsulate the whole thing. So let's just put the scoring as a private method that's called by the browser itself. We don't actually need to see it then. So let's change this. We're going to change the test. So we're going to, in our action, we're going to fetch the actual scores directly from the browser. And in which case, the browser method shouldn't be get HTTP headers. It should be score headers. So let's just implement that directly. Right. And so obviously we need to add this to our interface. Let's generate a new method there. And we get a compiler error immediately because we can see that both the test browser and the header browser don't implement this. So in our interface, we have our new method. I guess we can leave the get HTTP headers method there for the moment, although we're not actually using it. And we might want to remove it later on. So now we need to implement in our test browser the score headers method. At the moment, it's just going to throw a not implemented, but I think that's okay. We don't use it in the tests. We also need to implement the score headers method in our actual header browser. But I've just noticed the namespace is wrong here. I thought we had fixed that earlier, but we must have made some mistake. It should be secure header score. Now let's implement our score headers method and build. Right now our compiler errors are gone at least. So we can rerun our tests here to check that we haven't broken anything with our changes. And Of course, we'd expect that test to fail, but the rest of the tests should be green. Yes, and they are. So we still have to fix this test because it's not returning our score result at the moment because the method's not implemented. So initially, the browser is going to fetch our web page using the get HTTP header method, which we should fix soon enough so that it's a private method now, as soon as we've taken it away from the interface. And now we're going to return the score result from our score utils module, which we pass our headers into. So now that we've implemented our method, we can run our test again. And we can see that the result is green, right? So all our tests are green. Great. So this is a fairly significant result because what we've actually achieved here is one of the goals in our project. We wanted some method of being able to unit test the quality of our headers in the web pages that we're producing as part of our development process. Using this type of test, which we've created here, we can have a list of the URLs that are included in our project, in our development project, and we can build a unit test here which fetches the headers from our URLs, from the URLs that we're producing, and checks the quality of those headers from a security viewpoint. So instead of having checking that the result is 0 minus 1, we could check that the result reaches some minimum standard that we set as part of our policy. And in fact, we could build or change the score headers method so that it actually just checks, does this web page meet our minimum security standards? So here right away we have our method for unit testing, and we can build these standard unit tests which we apply for every new web page we produce, for every new web page project. Let's go further. Okay, so all our tests are green and we're fetching our content, we're stripping out the headers from that using the Scrapey browser, and we're actually scoring them. Now, we really would want to fill out our tests. So we'd want to test for all the different types of headers we would see. So for example, if we go to our score util, at the moment we're only just checking for content security policy, which is a good header, and server, which is a header that reveals information. Really, we'd want to implement and expand on this method and perhaps something more efficient than just an if-then search. Also, here we're only looking at whether or not the header exists. We're not actually doing any sort of assessment on the values, which we would obviously want to do. But as it is, we've got the structure in place. So we'd really want to have a lot more tests. But since this is compact, we're trying to keep this video short. I'm just going to go straight to implementing the utility now that we have our methods and our browsers in place. And in our secure header score, we have our main. So in our utility, we'd want to pass perhaps a URL. So we'd have our URL that we want to get a score for. And we can fetch that from the arguments. And then we're going to create a header browser. And then we're going to get our result from that URL. We're going to pass in that text as a URI using the URL we got from our arguments. So we want to produce this result printed out somehow to a file, but initially we can just write to the screen. We can say the good header score. plus results.item1. And we also want to print out our bad header score. And that should be it, I guess. So if we build that solution. Now we know that the score for Google, for example, gave us a 0 and a -1. Okay, we start a command prompt now and go to the catalog where we actually have created our program. We should be able to see our utility. Okay, so let's try this out then. Secure header score.exe, and remember when we're passing the text for our URI, it has to actually contain our protocol here. So HTTP, Google, it should be HTTPS, google.com. And there we can see we get our score, 0 good headers and -1 and 1 bad header. So how would we use this? Why would you build an executable like this? Well, this can be used in a number of ways. You could use it, for example, when you're building your websites in a part of a development team, you could actually run this utility as part of your unit tests when you know that you've got a list of the definitive URLs you're going to have. And so the development team can see right away what is the status. On a higher level, you could actually build this into your build process, and you could possibly have a security gate so that, for example, if the score does not reach a minimum level, then the build is disallowed. And again, you can do that using this utility. Or alternatively, you could actually, instead of having a command line prompt program here, you could have some sort of service which just runs all the time. And perhaps sitting on the Azure cloud external to your company website, which actually just has a list of URLs and constantly tests them once a night, say it's 2 o'clock in the morning, downloads all the web pages from the company websites and checks that all the good headers that you want are there. And that way you've got as a final check against some small change, somebody pumps out quickly as a response to an emergency situation, a new web page, and they don't fully understand the company security policy. So this sort of utility can be used in a large number of ways. I also recommend that you have a quick look at the projects, the work being done by Scott Helm, who's a security researcher and has done quite a lot on security headers and has this invaluable security header site where you can actually does more or less what our little utility does. So if I enter into Google here, let's just choose, it'll give it a score based on what was good and what was bad. So I hope this has been interesting to you, and I guess I'll see you whenever I create the next video. Thank you very much.